The storm raged outside, rain slashing against the broken windows like desperate hands trying to claw their way in. The abandoned estate was nothing more than a corpse of stone and decay, swallowed by time, forgotten by all, except for him. Ronan moved through the ruined corridors with the silent grace of a predator. His tall frame cut through the shadows, his golden eyes burning like molten fire beneath the dark hood of his cloak. The scent of rot and damp earth filled the air, but beneath it, something else called to him. Something cold, something unnatural. He stepped into an empty room, except it wasn't empty. In the farthest corner, chained to the wall like a discarded relic, sat a girl. No, not a girl. A vampire. Her wrists were bound in iron, her ankles chained to the stone floor, but she didn't look at him with fear. She didn't look at him at all. She sat motionless, her back resting against the wall, her long silver hair spilling over her shoulders like strands of moonlight. She wore the remnants of a once elegant gown, torn and faded, its silk hanging from her slender frame in whispers of lost nobility. Ronan's breath came slow and deep, his instincts screaming to turn away, to leave whatever wretched creature had been left to rot in this place. But he didn't move. Because then, she opened her eyes. They were the color of dying embers, dark and bottomless, framed by lashes as pale as snow. Hollow, starved, yet they held a quiet defiance, as if she had been waiting for him all along. His muscles coiled. His kind and hers were never meant to share the same air. And yet, here they were, caught in a moment that felt stolen from fate itself. She tilted her head slightly, studying him, and in that simple movement, something inside him clenched tight. She was frail, but not broken, weak, but not defeated. There was something in the way she held herself, like a blade left to rust, waiting to be sharpened once more. Ronan took a slow step forward. The wooden floor groaned under his weight, but she did not flinch. Her lips parted, and her voice, soft, silken, untouched by time, slid through the air like a whisper of a long-forgotten song. "You are not afraid of me." A slow, dark smile ghosted across his lips. "Should I be?" She exhaled a breath that might have been a laugh, might have been sorrow. They were. His gaze flickered to the chains around her wrists. The iron was old but enchanted, etched with symbols of restraint, a cruel prison designed for something meant to never die. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice rough with something he could not name. She lifted her hand slightly, letting the chains rattle like broken music. "My father." Ronan felt something stir in his chest, an anger that did not belong to him. He should have walked away. She was his enemy, a creature of the night, a parasite who should have been nothing more than prey. And yet, she was none of those things. She was something else, something fragile and deadly, something that shouldn't exist, yet did. He clenched his fists, fighting the pull that coiled around his spine, an ancient instinct far older than bloodshed, the need to own, to protect, to claim. Her lips curled, just slightly, as if she could sense the war within him. "You don't know what you found, wolf." His smirk was sharp, his golden eyes flashing in the darkness. "Neither do you." The storm howled beyond the walls, but inside that empty room, the air was charged with something far more dangerous than the night. The storm had not passed, but neither of them noticed anymore. The wind howled through the shattered windows, sweeping through the ruined estate like a chorus of ghosts. But in the hollow silence between each gust, there was only them. Ronan stood before her, a force of nature wrapped in muscle and shadows, his golden eyes fixed on the fragile girl before him. She should have been nothing, just another vampire, just another enemy. And yet she was unlike anything he had ever seen. Celine tilted her head, her silver hair catching the dim candlelight, casting a ghostly glow around her face. Even in chains, she held an air of quiet defiance, of something once regal now left to decay. But it was her eyes that held him captive, dark, ancient, burning with a sorrow that had no end. "Why are you still here?" she asked, her voice like silk over stone. He should have left. He had meant to. But his feet had not moved. His body had not obeyed. I don't know. His voice was low, rough, like distant thunder rolling through the mountains. A small, knowing smile curved her lips. You do. His jaw clenched. The chains on her wrists gleamed in the dim light, the runes carved into them humming with a silent curse. He didn't ask what she had done to deserve this. He already knew. Vampires didn't chain their own unless they feared them. What did you do? His voice was softer this time, but no less commanding. Her eyes never left his. I refused. Something inside him tightened. Refused what? To drink. The words hung between them, heavier than the air itself. A vampire who would not feed. A creature of hunger who had chosen starvation over survival. Foolish, self-destructive, beautiful. The thought struck him like a blade, unexpected and unwanted. He turned away, running a hand through his dark hair, his body humming with a frustration he couldn't name. He had to leave. He had to get out of this cursed place before it devoured him whole. But then, the scent of blood. Ronan had meant to pull away. He had meant to set her down, to regain control over the wildfire spreading through his veins. But the moment Celine's lips touched his skin, he was lost. She drank from him, each pull of her lips sending something primal through his body. It was unlike any pain he had ever known, because it wasn't pain at all. It was possession. His breath hitched, his golden eyes darkening as her cold fingers clutched at his shirt, trembling against him. The scent of her filled his senses. Ancient roses, storm-drenched silk, something dark and forbidden that no creature should ever desire. And yet he did. His grip on her tightened. He should have stopped her. He should have torn her away, ended this before it consumed them both. But he didn't. He couldn't. Celine exhaled a soft sound, something between a sigh and a moan, her body finally coming alive in his arms. And then, her fangs withdrew. A single drop of crimson lingered on her lips, glowing in the candlelight. Slowly, she looked up at him, her dark eyes wide, unfocused, as though she had just woken from a dream. The moment stretched between them. The silence between them was a living thing, thick and electric. Celine's fingers curled into Ronan's shirt, her breath uneven, her dark eyes holding a storm that threatened to consume them both. Ronan felt her pulse, weak, but steady. A vampire should not have a pulse, should not feel warmth. Yet she did. Because of him. She should have pulled away. He should have let her go. Neither moved. She smelled like midnight. Dark roses and winter frost, laced with something sharper, more intoxicating. His blood coursed through her now, and he could feel the way it was changing her, awakening something long buried in her cold, immortal flesh. A predator. A queen. His. Celine's lips parted, as if she were about to speak, but Ronan had already made his choice. With a growl, he reversed their positions, slamming her back against the wall. The impact made the candlelight flicker, shadows stretching and writhing around them like dark spirits drawn to the storm brewing between them. Celine gasped, her fingers tightening on his chest, but not in fear. She was testing him. Ronan smirked, lowering his head until their noses almost brushed. His body caged hers in, his warmth searing through the thin space between them. "You drank from me," he murmured, his voice rough, primal. "You should be afraid of what that means." Celine's breath hitched, but her gaze remained defiant. "And what does it mean, Wolf?" He exhaled a slow, deliberate breath, letting the heat of it ghost over her lips. "That you are mine now." A dangerous smile curved her lips. "Is that so?" He growled in warning, his fingers tightening at her waist, his claws threatening to emerge. "You feel it, don't you?" He leaned closer, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. The hunger, the heat. Her fingers trembled against him, her breath unsteady. She did feel it. She was fighting it. But they both knew it was useless. A vampire should not crave warmth, should not need it. Yet here she was, burning from his touch. Celine's gaze darkened, her deadly beauty sharp enough to cut. "I do not belong to you." Ronan's smirk deepened. "Not yet." In one swift motion, he lifted her off her feet, her back hitting the cold stone wall. Celine gasped, her legs instinctively wrapping around his waist, her hands clutching the shoulders. A challenge sparked in her eyes, but there was something else there now. Something raw, something undeniable. She wanted him. Not just his blood, not just his strength. Him. All of him. Ronan's grip tightened, his claws grazing the delicate curve of her hips. He was a beast, a predator, a creature of wild hunger. But with her, it was something else entirely. It was not hunger. It was possession. Celine's lips hovered dangerously close to his, her fangs glinting in the dim light. "You are playing with fire, wolf." His smirk deepened. Good. A breath. A heartbeat. A war neither of them wanted to win. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the real battle had just begun. Ronan had never craved anything the way he craved her. Celine was still in his grasp, her body a whisper of ice against his fire. The candlelight danced across her skin, tracing the elegant curve of her jaw, the delicate hollow of her throat. Her dark eyes glowed with something wild, something he wanted to claim. His instincts screamed at him to take, to sink his teeth into her pale skin, to leave his mark on the deadly creature that had bewitched him. But she was watching him, testing him, waiting. Celine tilted her head ever so slightly, exposing the vulnerable column of her neck. An invitation, a dare. "Show me, wolf." Her voice was soft, but laced with challenge. "Show me how dangerous you really are." Ronan growled low in his throat, his hands tightening around her waist. She thought she could provoke him, that she could control this fire between them. She had no idea what she was playing with. He moved swiftly, slamming her back against the cold stone wall once more. The impact sent dust trickling from the ceiling, but she did not flinch. She only smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made his pulse hammer. Damn her. He could feel it, the way she responded to him, the way his heat burned against her frost. A vampire should not need warmth. And yet, Celine was melting. Her fingers trailed up his chest, feather-light but deliberate, as if mapping the ridges of muscle beneath his skin. When she reached his throat, she paused, feeling the steady, powerful pulse there. A shudder rippled through her. Ronan smirked. "You want more, don't you?" Celine's breath hitched. For the first time, she hesitated. She was immortal. She had walked through centuries untouched, unshaken. No creature had ever held power over her. Until now. Her silence was answer enough. Ronan leaned in, his mouth brushing against the shell of her ear. "You don't know what to do with this, do you?" His voice was a husky whisper, teasing, taunting. "With me." Celine's fingers twitched against his skin. Her control was slipping. She hated it. She loved it. And he knew it. She bared her fangs in a warning. "You think you've won." Ronan chuckled, the sound dark and full of promise. "I think you're lying to yourself." Celine moved faster than lightning, her hand snapping up to his throat, her fingers pressing into his pulse. "I could rip this out," she whispered, her voice a blade against his skin. He let her hold him there. Let her pretend she had the upper hand. Then he gripped her wrist, slowly prying her fingers away. His strength dwarfed hers. He could snap her bones like twigs, could overpower her in a heartbeat. But he didn't. Instead, he dragged her hand down, pressing it over his chest, right over his heart, letting her feel the beast inside him, the wild, untamed thing that had already decided she was his. Celine inhaled sharply. Her fingers curled against him. Her control shattered. Ronan smirked. "Now, let's see who's really won." The fire between them exploded. Celine should have fled. She should have disappeared into the night, left him standing alone in the ruins of that forgotten room, his fire burning unanswered. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Ronan's breath was warm against her skin, his body caging her against the cold stone. Every inch of him was alive with raw, untamed power, so different from the silent, deathly world she had always known. His heartbeat was thunder, steady and commanding, a sound she was never meant to crave. And yet she did. Her fingers curled against his chest, feeling the solid muscle beneath, the heat, the strength. He was a storm barely restrained, and Celine wanted to stand in its center, let it consume her until nothing of her old self remained. But the hunger between them was dangerous. It clawed at her, whispered to her in a voice she couldn't silence. She felt Ronan's hand trail along her arm, slow, deliberate, claiming her without words. A werewolf and a vampire. A beast and a ghost. It was wrong, unnatural. Yet, when his fingers tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze, she knew there was no turning back. "You've never let anyone touch you like this." His voice was deep, edged with knowing. Celine's lips parted, but no words came. Ronan smirked. He could see through her, past the cold elegance, past the centuries of solitude. She could hide behind her fangs, behind the illusion of power, but not from him. Not anymore. "Why me?" His voice was softer now, almost taunting. Celine's throat tightened. She had no answer, no excuse, only a truth she couldn't escape. Ronan's eyes darkened, something wild flickering beneath the surface. He wanted her surrender. Not just her body, but her will, her control. Celine inhaled sharply as he leaned in, his lips hovering just above hers. He was waiting, testing. Would she pull away? Would she deny what had already been decided? A vampire never yielded. Celine had never yielded. But for him, just this once, she did. Her breath mingled with his, cool against his heat, her lips a whisper away. It was barely a touch, and yet it shattered every unspoken rule between their kinds. Ronan exhaled, his grip tightening around her waist. His restraint was slipping. He had spent his life as a predator, a hunter who took what he wanted. But this was different. Celine was not prey. She was an addiction, a curse, and he would never be free of her. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to drown in the moment. In him. But just as his lips brushed against hers, a sound shattered the silence. A deep, distant howl. The pack. Ronan stiffened, his body going rigid against hers, his instincts sharpened, danger flooding his veins. Celine's eyes snapped open. The moment between them cracked, fragile as glass. Ronan's gaze shifted to the doorway, his expression darkening. They had been found. Celine took a step back, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She was a vampire. He was a werewolf. This was a war. Ronan clenched his jaw, torn between duty and something far more dangerous. Celine swallowed hard. "We have to go." But Ronan didn't move. His eyes, wild and unrelenting, locked onto hers. "This isn't over." His voice was a promise, a threat. Celine's pulse, though lifeless, thundered in her ears. No, this was only the beginning. Ronan ran. The night tore past him in streaks of black and silver, the scent of damp earth and burning wood thick in the air. His muscles coiled and released in a relentless rhythm, his instincts screaming at him to return to his pack, to fight, to end this war before it swallowed him whole. But his soul had already chosen a different battle. Her. Celine moved beside him, silent as a shadow, her dark cloak billowing like a phantom's wings. She was fast, faster than she had any right to be, but Ronan matched her step for step, refusing to let her slip away. The trees blurred, the ruins now far behind them. The night was alive with the distant echoes of howls. His pack was calling. But Ronan didn't answer. Celine finally stopped atop a ridge, her breath steadied despite the brutal pace. She turned, the moonlight carving her into something unreal. Pale skin like porcelain, eyes like dying embers. A monster, a goddess, a curse. and Ronan wanted her more than he had ever wanted anything. "They're coming," she said, voice low, unreadable. Ronan stepped closer, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He should let her go. He should run to his kind and pretend she had never touched him, never stolen his reason, never broken the laws written in blood. But he wouldn't. His hand shot out, fingers curling around her wrist. No more running. Celine stiffened, a sharp inhale, barely audible. His touch burned where her skin should have been cold. She tilted her chin up, defiant. "What are you doing?" Ronan's grip tightened, not enough to hurt, but enough to claim. Making a choice. Celine's throat bobbed as if she wanted to speak, to argue, to remind him that he was a beast, and she was a nightmare, and that their love, if it could even be called that, was doomed before it had begun. But she said nothing, because she knew that this had already gone too far, knew that she had let him past her defenses in ways no one else had. Ronan raised his other hand, brushing his fingers along the side of her face. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. And that was what destroyed him. She wanted this too. His breath was uneven now, his restraint hanging by a thread. "Say it." His voice was rough, demanding. "Say you feel this." Celine's eyes flickered. A battle raged behind them, logic warring with desire, duty clashing with something deeper. But in the end, there was only truth. Yes. The word shattered between them, as fragile as glass, as dangerous as fire. Ronan's pulse roared. She had just sealed her fate. And his. The distance between them disappeared in an instant. Celine exhaled sharply as Ronan caged her against him, his warmth overpowering, his presence consuming. Her fingers curled against his chest, as if she needed something to hold on to before the storm took her. But Ronan had no intention of letting her steady herself. She had dragged him into this madness. Now she would drown in it with him. His lips hovered above hers, his breath mixing with hers in the cold air. One more step, one more sin, one more moment before they crossed the point of no return. And then, a snarl tore through the night. Ronan spun, his instincts flaring. The pack had arrived. Celine's eyes widened, the spell between them breaking like shattered bone. But it was too late. The hunt had begun. The forest pulsed with danger. Moonlight bathed the clearing in silver fire, illuminating the dozen figures that emerged from the darkness. Ronan's pack. Their golden eyes glowed with fury, claws gleaming, fangs bared. The air was thick with tension, the scent of bloodlust poisoning the wind. Celine stood beside Ronan, her stillness deceptive. She was a blade wrapped in silk, an angel of death draped in midnight. Yet for the first time, there was no amusement in her gaze, no teasing cruelty, only resignation. They would not let her leave alive. Ronan knew it, and they would not let him stand beside her. The largest of the wolves stepped forward. Donovan, the beta, his second in command. His voice was rough, thick with betrayal. "You've lost your mind." Ronan's body coiled, muscles tight with the need to strike. His wolf surged beneath his skin, demanding blood. His blood. Their blood. No one would take her from him. Celine's voice was soft, but it cut through the air like a whisper of death. "You should let us go." The wolves snarled in unison, their hackles rising. Letting a vampire go was never an option. Ronan stepped in front of her, his voice a dark promise. "You'll have to kill me first." Silence. A heavy pause. And then, Donovan lunged. Ronan moved faster. Their bodies collided with a sickening crack, the impact shaking the earth beneath them. Claws tore through flesh. Blood sprayed against the cold night air. Snarls and growls echoed through the trees, a brutal symphony of violence. Celine watched, her lips parted, fingers twitching at her sides. She could end this in seconds, rip through them like paper. But this was not her fight. This was his choice. Ronan was a storm, a force of nature fueled by fury, and something darker, something primal. He struck without hesitation, his strength undeniable, his dominance absolute. Wolves fell around him, one by one, their bodies broken, their pride shattered, until only Donovan remained. Blood dripped from Ronan's hands, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Donovan staggered to his feet, wiping blood from his mouth. His gaze flickered to Celine, then back to Ronan. And in that moment, something changed. Not submission, acceptance. With a slow exhale, Donovan stepped back. His voice was low, rough. Then go. Ronan didn't wait. He turned to Celine, gripping her wrist, his touch firm, commanding. A silent vow. She followed. They ran into the night, leaving behind the only world he had ever known. For her. For them. And as the shadows swallowed them whole, Ronan knew he would never let her go.